The most expensive camera that I have ever had has been the biggest source of frustration and quite frankly, the biggest shock I've ever had in using a camera. And in today's video, I'm going to tell you why and what I have learned. Because if you are like me and you like the idea of shooting in black and white and maybe you want to force yourself to shoot in black and white more, well, if that's you, then this video is for you today. But before we get into all that, if this is your first time here, my name is Dave. I'm a photographer and videographer from the Bay Area of California. Be sure to subscribe to this channel. I post 2 videos a week unless something goes horribly wrong. If you've been following this channel at all in the past, like 6 months to a year, you may recall that I picked up a Q2 Monochrome earlier this year. Now I used to have a Q2, but I sold it last year because I just don't love shooting 28mm all the time. One of the reasons I love my M is that I have a diversity of focal lengths, and shooting the Q2, it just wasn't for me in the long run. And I don't know why I thought that getting a Q2 monochrome would change that fact. Because while I did enjoy the process of shooting the Q2 monochrome and I definitely loved the photos that I got, I still didn't love 28mm. But shooting the monochrome forced me to think in black and white more. And honestly, I began to question a lot about my photography. I went really deep into like color versus black and white philosophy. I read this book, A Question of Color, and it was about color and black and white and that whole thought process. I'm gonna link this below because honestly, this was a great book to process through. But even with all that, I still wasn't completely sure of what I preferred. And while I learned a lot during my time with the Q2 monochrome, I still wasn't really sure if my problems were shooting monochrome or shooting on a 28mm lens, which would have made more sense because I just, again, don't love that focal length all the time. And the only way to really know for sure if it was the monochrome experience or if it was the 28mm that I felt conflicted about was to get an M11 monochrome. And after selling off some gear, including the Q2 monochrome, I found a guy who was selling this camera and I took the risk and picked it up. So let's talk about my first impressions. Well, it's an M. And honestly, it is no different of an experience than shooting my M11 or any other M I've ever had for that matter. So as far as experience goes, if you're looking for a different experience in a camera, this is not going to be it. And for me, honestly, it's a positive because I love the rangefinder experience. I love the M experience. That's why I use this camera 99% of the time. So regarding the experience of this camera, it's an M11, except it's monochrome. But there were 2 expectations that I had coming into this, and I want to talk about those for just a minute. My first expectation was I really expected a drastic increase in the sharpness of the photos that come out of this camera versus the M11. Because honestly, that was my experience using the Q2 monochrome against the Q2. The Q2 monochrome really blew the Q2 away in terms of sharp photos. I mean, they were like razor sharp. Now the explanation, as I understand it, is that when you remove the Bayer filter from a sensor, which is the part of the sensor that processes RGB information, the light has to go through less hardware, and because of that, you just get a sharper photo. Now, regarding the M11 monochrome against the M11, I have not found this to be the case. My photos on the M11 monochrome are incredibly sharp, but they're also incredibly sharp on the M11. Like if you were to A/B these, I can't really see a difference just on my eyes looking at the 2 together. This is probably due to the quality of M lenses versus maybe the quality of the Q lens. The sensor really is going to make a big difference on the Q, but maybe it doesn't make as much of a difference in terms of sharpness on the M. Your experience definitely may differ, but as far as I can tell, I don't see a huge increase in sharpness. The other expectation I had was regarding the noise on the M11 monochrome against the M11. On the M11, or really any color sensor, especially at a high megapixel, when you start to get a high ISO, you start to introduce a lot of noise. And with most camera systems, this noise isn't very pleasing. It kind of can look like colored speckles, like white, red, green. It just doesn't look good. But let's talk about the M11 noise real quick. Last year, I took the M11 to Disneyland with the family, and I had the 35 Summilux on, and I got some photos in some low light situations on rides. This one particular photo really stood out to me regarding the noise on the M11. This photo is 12,500, straight out the camera. That is really high. Yet, I wouldn't say that the noise on this M11 photo at 12,500 is bad. Actually, I kind of like it in this scenario. The noise is creating some halation around the highlights that almost make it look like film straight out of the camera. Now, I will say that the M11 Monochrome does take this to new levels. This photo is a spectacular work of art. As you can tell, it's me in my bathroom, but it's also at 12,500. You can see the noise difference between these two photos. The M11 Monochrome is incapable of having any color in the noise, so it just looks sandier and finer, and that makes it look, to me, more filmic. But if you start to push this camera higher, and I'm talking like high, like this other beautiful photo that I took in my bathroom at 100,000 ISO, I wouldn't say that a photo of this quality is like thrown out the door, but if I had taken this on an M11, yeah, I would delete it super fast. And I took this photo in the dark. I left like the door cracked open and a little bit of daylight was coming in, but I could barely see what I was focusing on. So I'm impressed with this camera's ability to make a good photo at a high ISO in nearly total darkness. That's pretty impressive. But then I also have to ask myself, like, how often am I shooting in my bathroom in near total darkness at 100,000 ISO? And the answer is like once a week. No, seriously, the answer is like never. I'm really never in that kind of scenario where the lighting is that low. But truth be told, I really do prefer the noise out of the M11 Monochrome, but the M11 is really not that bad at a normally high ISO. Now, if you start pushing it like up to where I push this one, yeah, it looks terrible. But for me, I am rarely shooting above like 6,400 on the M11, and if it wasn't for this thing's ability to go higher and look great, I probably would never shoot this over 6,400 either, because it's not the kind of photography that I do. Now, there's something else that I'm going to share, and honestly, it was like the biggest letdown or point of frustration or shock, as I mentioned at the very beginning. But before we get into all of that, let me tell you real quick about this channel's Patreon, because I'm gonna put some M11M files on the Patreon so you can go on there and download them yourself and see what I'm talking about in just a minute. Now, there is a link below to join the Patreon community for this channel, and it's also the Patreon community for my shop, Very Good Presets. I try to keep the Patreon community just like super affordable and high value. So here's what you get. As I develop new presets for Very Good Presets, I put them in the Patreon community before they get released while they're in beta, and then you guys can try them and test them and use them and give me feedback if you want. Additionally, when a new preset is dropped on Very Good Presets, the Patreon community gets a free download if they are currently subscribed. It's not retroactive because I could see people taking like serious advantage of that, but if you subscribe, going forward, if a preset comes out on Very Good Presets, it becomes yours, which can save you a significant amount of money if you like buying presets and you already shop at verygoodpresets.com. I'm working on some other value added for the Patreon community as well, so this is a great time to jump on. Patreon is pretty important for this channel because it helps sustain what I'm doing here. And if you enjoy this kind of video or information, simply investing on Patreon helps me sustain it. So a big thank you to the Patreon community. And if you are considering it, there's information right below that you can check out and download some M11M files while you're in there. Okay, so here it is, the big one, the thing that I hated the most about these photos whenever I pulled them off the card and into Lightroom. The thing that nobody has talked about, or at least that I've seen on any other video about the M11 Monochrome. The thing that I completely have had to learn on my own. And that is that these M11 Monochrome files are not like any other digital RAW file that I've ever used, including the Q2 Monochrome. The files that come off of the M11 Monochrome are completely different. And it's not because they're monochrome. It's because they are basically the equivalent of a log file in video. If you shoot any video and you shoot in log, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Log video files have no contrast. They have like very little dynamics to them. They're just a flat, completely janky looking image, but you can do whatever you want with them in color grading and make them look awesome. Right now I'm shooting an S-Log3 on my Sony, and you can see the log and you can see the color grade. So there's like 1,000 benefits to shooting in log. Well, the M11 monochrome files, they are logged black and white. Nobody says it, camera doesn't advertise it, but to me, that is the equivalent of what I've gotten out of this camera. And I hated this at first because I pulled off the files and I was like, these are so flat. Like shooting high contrast monochrome JPEGs on my M11 look way better than shooting raw on the M11 monochrome. And my mentality in shooting this camera was, I'm not gonna be doing like a ton of color grading, they're monochrome files. So I'm not gonna come in here and like make all these edits and use all these presets on my monochrome raw files. I just wanted them to look good when I got them off the camera. And instead, I got these very flat, low contrast looking photos. Again, they were log files basically. To get a pleasing contrast, one that I would say is like comparable to shooting high contrast JPEG on the M11, I have been bringing the blacks down to -55 and the whites up to 20 just to get what I would describe as like normal looking contrast. And yet in doing so, I can still see the information that is in the blacks and in those deep shadows. That is freaking mind-boggling to me. And just to be clear, I have never done this with an M11 file where I'm tweaking contrast at that level. In fact, on a lot of my M11 files, I'm actually removing contrast and not adding it. And when I realized that the M11 monochrome files were basically log files right out of the camera, that's when the M11 monochrome really clicked. I really hated this camera when I took it out the first few times, but now it's starting to make sense. If you prefer to shoot in black and white, you are going to be blown away by the latitude of the raw files that come out of this camera. This is very different than shooting some high contrast JPEG or simply converting your color files to black and white. This is a totally different experience in post. I mean, you can basically take the light spectrum of these raw files in any direction you want, and that's actually pretty cool. But you're gonna hate this camera if you're looking for something straight out of the camera that already has like that look baked in. The raw files here, they just don't seem to have that. And yes, I could shoot JPEG on this, and I might actually do that sometimes. But now I'm like so just blown away by the raw files, I kinda wanna keep playing with them. So the verdict is still out as to how long the M11 monochrome is going to ride shotgun alongside the M11 back here, but I definitely want to give it a fair shot. At first, I didn't think this camera was gonna make it out of this month. I was already thinking, yeah, this was a mistake. I should probably go ahead and relist this thing and get my money back. But now I'm wondering how much this is going to stretch me, how much it's going to push me, and how much it's going to change my approach to photography. This kind of growth is kind of like paying for an education at like a university or something. You go into it knowing you're taking some class, but you don't really know what all you're gonna get out of that class until the end. So school's in session with the M11 monochrome. And yeah, I kind of hate it, but I'm gonna see what happens as I get more familiar with the log files that come out of this camera. Who knows, maybe we'll end up falling in love and this will replace that. Not according to this book. Again, check out that link below, because I think I actually do prefer color, but we'll see. Check it out. Link below, all this stuff. Thanks for watching. See you guys next time.